Daniel Bella studied philosophy at Goethe University in Frankfurt, Germany. His research focuses on the vicissitudes of the concept of real potentiality within the history of Western philosophy, especially in the work of Ernst Bloch, Spinoza, and Alfred North Whitehead. He is currently working on a PhD on the relation between potentiality and prevention in medieval and early modern thought. And Milan Stürmer is a researcher at the Institute of Culture and Aesthetics of Digital Media at Leuphana University in Lüneburg, Germany, at the Chair for Media Culture and Media Philosophy. He is currently completing his PhD on the proliferation of forms of debt in the 20th and 21st century in the context of the breakthrough of an ecological relational thinking. And their presentation today is entitled Fill in the Blanks, Social Ethics Between Environment and Inheritance.
Yeah, can you all hear me? Cool.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you for the introduction and of course for having us. It's been an absolute blast so far, even though it's quite late now in Hamburg or in Germany generally. Having started a Whitehead reading group, honestly, quite literally on a drunken whim more than 6 years ago now, I think neither Daniel nor me expected to be still kind of like clockwork, meeting up once a week to read and discuss Whitehead 6 years later, and most recently going through the second volume of the Harvard lectures. So we are genuinely very honored to have the opportunity to discuss and present in front of such a group of distinguished Whitehead scholars. We will be presenting our reading of the Cabot seminar from HL2. And I think it actually fits quite well within the day-to-day. So we're picking up, I think, some of the arguments from the first session. So the point that Christian Frigerio made regarding the appeal to causation as memory. And then Professor Lucas' following point in the discussion about the asymmetrical internal relations. But of course, I think crucially, we're also following up from the talks of Paul Bogart and Philippe Gagnon that we have just heard. So thanks to the organizer, not just for putting on this fantastic event, but also I think for the very thoughtful scheduling. And I shouldn't waffle on too much with that 20 minutes. So I'm going to read the first half of the paper, and then to make it a bit more varied so late in the day, Daniel is going to read the second half. So our paper is called Fill in the Blanks, Social Ethics Between Environment and Inheritance. A key promise of the philosophy of organism was always that it would offer a third way between mechanism and vitalism, a third way between a determined universe and the incoherent chaos of pure autotelic randomness. Physical necessity renders all entities passive in dispossessing them of every original contribution, whilst pure voluntarism leaves the entity with nothing but itself. To put it most bluntly, as I think this helps in an online setting, are we mechanically determined by our environment, or can we just do as we please? Obviously, both options are non-starters for moral considerations and leave us with the challenge to establish a convincing relation between metaphysics or physics and ethics. As this question cannot be answered in the abstract, let us begin by looking at the organism in its environment. There must be a favorable place, an oikaios topos, as the ancient ecologist Theophrastus would have it, in the environment into which the organism fits. So today we would probably speak of a niche, but we are using the word fit to point to the influence of Lawrence Henderson, about which we have already heard today. And I think, at least for me, it's incredibly productive to think, or it's been incredibly productive so far to think about the divergence of Whitehead from Henderson in HL2. So I think Paul Bogart was particularly clear on this earlier, and I think we will discuss this for weeks to come. For Henderson, it is quite true that, I quote, the origin of fitness is in part explained by the mechanistic hypothesis, end quote. Yet the environment as that into which the organism fits is itself not simply given. Whitehead's philosophy of the organism, especially in the context of his comments on Henderson, accepts that the environment gives its contribution, that's a quote, but equally insists that the organism creates its environment and selects from it. Hence, we can speak of the fitness of the environment. For Henderson, and here Whitehead diverges from him, this means that the relation between organism and environment is considered to be, I quote, completely and perfectly reciprocal, end quote. In our short presentation today, we want to put up for discussion and perhaps unseemly bold claim, drawing mainly on Whitehead's guest lecture in Richard Clark Cabot's course on social ethics, to which we will simply refer to as 20A. The lack of a dedicated engagement with ethics in Whitehead has often been noted, and with the publication of HL2, we now have an insight into, as the editors write, I quote, perhaps the only thing from Whitehead that is exclusively an extended discussion of his views on ethics, end quote. Its importance is at least partly due to the fact that it contains an explicitly stated ethical principle which envisions a common good. Prior to the publication of 20A, the main point of reference for Whitehead ethics was the 8th categorical obligation, the category of subjective intensity, on which, according to Whitehead, quote, the greater part of morality hinges, end quote. The reason for this is that it expands on the dual character of the subjective aim, being not just directed at the immediate present, but also the relevant future. For those commentators very unsatisfied by this explanation in Process and Reality, some of the statements we can find in 20A must appear doubly problematic. For instance, when Whitehead defines evil as a satisfaction that deprives the world of, quote, a more intense self-realization which would otherwise be open to it, end quote. Or when he states that an actual entity is also an attainment, I quote again, by reason of what inherits or makes possible beyond itself, end quote. In the following, we are proposing to take these assertions seriously. Our claim is that for Whitehead, the problem of ethics is situated beyond relations of reciprocity and mutual dependency. Returning to the question of the environment, Whitehead clarifies his usage of the term by employing an inherently asymmetric instead of a reciprocal relation, the relation of inheritance. At first sight, reducing the conception of the environment to an actual entity's inheritance of past occasions seems to be of disastrous consequence for ethics. Since each actual entity is individuated by its own private aim, we are once again faced with the question how these present aims are able to account for the aims and satisfaction of actual entities in the future. Whitehead's metaphysics is able to go beyond singular satisfactions only if we take his theories of enduring objects into consideration. As we want to argue, it is exactly through the level of such compound entities that the metaphysical grounding of ethics might become possible. That such entities are derived from actual entities is not necessarily detrimental. Rather, aggregated entities like societies are able to close the gap between metaphysics and ethics exactly because they do not possess an aim or satisfaction of their own. If our interpretation is convincing, 20A invites us to construe statements pertaining to enduring objects in Whitehead's other works as ethical considerations. One candidate might be civilization. We will only be able to gesture towards it, but we think that based on 20A, there might perhaps be some value in the thought experiment of tentatively replacing the word civilized in Whitehead's text with the word ethical. Our previous engagement with Whitehead, and by our, I mean Daniel Bellas and mine, of course, has revolved around the notion of inheritance, not just as a very concrete way to think about our relation to the environment as that which is already there and shapes us, but also as a key metaphor to think about the relation between cause and effect and what it means to be civilized. We have written about this in more detail, but the crux of the matter is to conceptualize the effect as engaged in choosing its own causes. So as we were both making our way through the 2 volumes of the Harvard lectures, we were quite excited to see not only some of our reading confirmed by the Radcliffe and Harvard lectures from the fall semester of 1925, but much more importantly, expanded and augmented by 20A. In it, Whitehead argues that serious ethical insights require metaphysical investigations, and further that metaphysics inevitably possesses an ethical character. Whitehead presents Descartes as the epitome of the philosopher who tries to base his metaphysics solely on physical principles. As a result, Descartes' metaphysic is able to account neither for original sin nor for original virtue. As Whitehead explains, both concepts assume, I quote, the doctrine that whatever you are infects the world, so that the world derives from you an original sin and an original virtue, because whatever you are infects the world, end quote, which is something that Descartes denies. This is a remarkable statement which entails a critique that works at least on two levels. Whitehead claims that the Cartesian assumption that all real entities must be self-sufficient regarding their existence precludes relations of existential dependency between those entities. And as a result, a kind of virtue or sin, which is transmitted by the act of existential reproduction, cannot be described within this framework. On a more implicit level, Whitehead's considerations also reflect the fact that the contrary assumptions that all entities are completely externally determined within the causal chain also renders original virtue or original sin impossible. We cannot reconstruct this in detail here, but the important point is that neither voluntaristic nor deterministic conceptions of the organism are compatible with what Whitehead calls original virtue or sin. And here I hand over to Daniel.
In his own engagement with original sin and original virtue, Whitehead proposes at least two generalizations. First, dependency or solidarity encompasses all entities whatsoever. Second, this dependency defines what it is to be an individual entity pursuing a unique aim. Whitehead says, quote, so an actual entity is an attainment for itself, individualized attainment, not only by reason of its own originality, but by reason of what it inherits or makes possible beyond itself. For you cannot dissociate the actual entity, even on the side of its own individual attainments, to the total society. And this is the doctrine of social solidarity, which I express by the two doctrines of original virtue and original sin, unquote. In other words, the individuality of an actual entity cannot be explained by reference to something that depends uniquely on the actual entity in question. Originality and inheritance are not contradictory. Instead, the creation of something new requires the inheritance, whilst the original content itself is handed down to further actual entities. It is exactly the conception of inheritance which brings together metaphysics and ethics dissociated by Descartes and his successors. This mutual dependence of inheritance and originality allows for an interesting description. Whitehead causes some astonishment when he says that, quote, it is exactly true that we create environments favorable to each other, unquote. When Whitehead states that an entity arises out of the environment and immediately specifies this as, quote, out of its inheritance of the whole world, unquote, we can see how swiftly he removes the connotations of the surround from the concept of the environment. As Germans, we would say, das Umhafte der Umwelt, and gives it a temporal dimension. This of course, makes sense when viewed from the perspective of process and reality, where things that are simultaneous cannot cause each other, for this is what simultaneity means, but goes against the grain of common conceptions of the organism-environment relation. It is not a reciprocal relation, but an inheritance of the past, for, as we have said today, causation is memory. As he considers the environment as an inheritance, there is no ontological difference between an organism and its environment because both are composed out of the same building blocks, actual entities. Any distinction between them requires a certain perspective which focuses on the realization of a specific end within the cosmological process. At this moment, it seems fair to reflect on the consequences of our argument. Whitehead rigorously defends the thesis that aims and ends are deeply embedded in his metaphysics insofar as they describe what it means to become a certain actual entity. Since actual entities are all there is, many scholars have defended the view that Whitehead subscribes to a private interest theory. 28 parades further evidence proving that such interpretations are flawed. Whitehead not only addresses the individual satisfaction of singular actual entities, but also considers the collective as a necessary part of this conception. Whitehead remarks are worth to be cited at length. Quote, That peculiar, that special actual entity attaining that particular end may be attaining a less formal self-satisfaction that was open to it for itself. Or what is even still worse, maybe by its qualification of the entities that succeed, maybe blank to the world in general, of a more intense actuality, a more intense self-realization, which would otherwise be open to it, and that is evil. So evil is really plunging the world in the direction of nothingness, end of quote. There are at least 2 points at issue here. First, Whitehead holds the view that we can talk about satisfaction independent of actual realizations. Second, these formal considerations even work on a collective level. Thus, Whitehead is convinced that his cosmology can account for propositions like, if the satisfaction of actual entity X would have been alpha, the satisfaction of actual entity Z would have been beta instead of gamma. Given the fact that gamma is more intense than beta, the inheritance given by actual entity X is evil with regard to actual entity Z. This poses the question how Whitehead's cosmology can approach the satisfaction of actual entities from the outside on a merely formal level without taking their existence into consideration. If you assume that actual entities are individuated by their specific satisfactions, then we have to accept that counterfactual propositions about satisfactions do refer to different actual entities. Thus, we are not talking about different satisfactions of one actual entity set, but of different possible actual entities, one with the satisfaction beta and one with the satisfaction gamma. On top of that, even actual entity X would have been another actual entity if it had counterfactually realized satisfaction alpha. This is pernicious for an ethical theory because it entails that every action implies a different subject. Hence, it is ontologically impossible to compare different actions of a subject regarding their moral value.
You've got about 3 minutes.
Wonderful. In what follows, we want to suggest that this problem can be solved if we move to the level of society. Though we cannot discuss their details here, it seems safe to say that societies have in common to be enduring and are therefore able to change. Further, these enduring entities do not have a proper aim on their own. Every satisfaction they entail can be reduced to actual entities. As a result, these enduring structures provide a metaphysical grounding because they stand in for the interrelatedness of different satisfactions. So Whitehead can be remarkably clear in what he understands to be good. Quote, insofar as it tends toward the greatest reality which is open from the standpoint of the present, insofar as it is dead, it is good, end of quote. What we would suggest from here is to take this approach to ethics, to be vocal about the fact that Whitehead does not simply follow a private interest theory, but genuinely engages with questions of the ethical order in the sense of an order that preserves openness, that allows for a favorable place for an entity's self-satisfaction while passing on possibilities beyond itself. This question of openness is something that is discussed in some detail in both science and the modern world, and of course, particularly in The Adventures of Ideas. Civilization, Whitehead holds there, quote, is the maintenance of social orders ordered by its own inherent persuasiveness, end of quote. In those works, Whitehead terms that mode of transmission civilized, and following 20a, we could perhaps say ethical, which preserves freedom for all the successors who, due to the transitive character of the temporal process, will not be able to give something back, but only to provide something for the future. This is not an ecological way of thinking, but if we are allowed a brief comment here, it might be one that environmentalism needs. En lieu of a presumptuous conclusion on Whitehead's ethics, let us, in the last minute, briefly return to the topic of the conference and finish with a somewhat cheesy ending. What struck us when reading both volumes of the Harvard lectures together were all the blank spaces that it leaves. The blank is ostensibly a convincing metaphor to address the assumed inability of Whitehead's metaphysics to ground his ethics. While it is true that actual entities are not sufficient by themselves, the picture gets filled in if we add enduring objects. This leads us to our second, much more nuanced blank. Enduring objects do not possess a proper aim and therefore allow for relating and comparing different aims with each other. So as we are thinking about inheritance, and especially as this is one of Whitehead's favorite examples for it, the inheritance of a tradition, we kept coming back to the actual blanks in the text, not as a flaw in the transmission, but as a metaphor for the favorable place that makes space to make something possible beyond itself, that enables a particularly ethical and civilized engagement with the text. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you both. Let's thank Milan and Daniel for a really great, this is my favorite topic. I'm going to not abuse my moderator privileges. I'm very tempted to do so, but George and Joe are in the queue, and I'm hopefully others will join. So resisting the urge to jump in, I will, George, why don't you join in? There you go.
Okay. Let me do it for you then, Brian, because I was thinking this was something you and I have quarreled about, argued about over the years, you know, how the ethics fits into the larger Whiteheadian scheme and what sort of ethics it is. I would be thrilled if this overall seminar 20A somehow addressed that question more substantively than I think it does. I think Daniel put it beautifully, the paradox at the end, that there are these spaces where we would like to have ethics, but we don't see it being sustained by the metaphysics. And I then look in the volume and find these interesting quotes that just jumped out at me when I first started working on my own paper. Ethics, Socrates, page 60, has ruined metaphysics. As a man of science, I feel so. The pre-Socratics were getting along, they were doing well. Then Socrates spoiled things. And a couple of pages further on, ethics has to do with the comparison of occasions and the idea of endurance. It's concerned with survival, value, and progress. It presupposes art. We know that's hardly surprising, but art requires ethics derived from itself. Socrates' emphasis on ethics was a wrong turn and, ironically, a precursor of Descartes. So Descartes is not inimical to this. Descartes focuses on the subject. He brings in, what does he say here at 63? Sorry, my vision is not good. Descartes turns back, retaining Christianity and logic, the mind and the body. The mind is the subject of the wrong kind and the focus of ethics. So from Socrates to Descartes, we have a focus on the subject. We have ignorance of metaphysics, giving up nature, and Whitehead is wholly opposed to it. My own dissertation back in the 70s on Hegel and Whitehead was designed to bring ethics back into process metaphysics by finding a source outside of Whitehead who could fill what Daniel described as those gaps. But I didn't find much there, other than this one thing that Milan mentioned in his part of the presentation, that I guess the way we'd conceptualize it now as we look at artificial intelligence and cyber and things like that, an occasion is not just for itself an actual entity, it can poison the database for the future for all other entities that follow in its mistake. I called this in the 70s derivative responsibility, and related it to a saying of St. Paul that, you know, there's a sense in which we're responsible through our own acts for the kinds of things that others will do on the basis of those, setting a bad example, or as we say in AI now, poisoning, prejudicing the database, the big database. And boy, is the past a big database for Whitehead. So these are intriguing, but I find I almost couldn't bring myself to take seriously the Whitehead's appearance in the Cabot seminar because of his otherwise antipathy towards things ethical.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thank you for mentioning Socrates, because I mean, and I think this is something that really is astonishing. And now with HL2, we are in a much more better situation to evaluate Whitehead's thoughts on Socrates. I mean, in other works, he also combines him with the dictionary and says something like, you know, Socrates, despite of now turning himself towards the people of Athens and trying to make conversations with them, he really tries to force them to develop fixed notions. And probably this is something that does not fit up with ethics at all, and especially for Whitehead, that you can't abstract from specific situations, moral concepts, and after it then say, yeah, you know, you have not really a compatible concept of virtue. So so that does really help us to do good ethics. And so I'm really glad that you mentioned Socrates, because I think we can see here against all the project of or the, I don't know, the doctrines in our textbooks, where we always say, you know, Socrates was the first who did something like ethics, and before there was natural philosophy. Whitehead is really critical about this, if this really can be considered an ethical journeyman. So yeah, thank you.
Joe, would you like to join in? Unless Milan, did you have anything you want? Okay, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, first, one quick thing that I just wanted to mention as kind of a housekeeping note, and I think you guys probably realize this already, but just because it wasn't mentioned in your paper, that 12 days later in his October 30th 3B lecture, Whitehead repeats a lot of the stuff that he had said in the Cabot seminar in that class, which I thought was interesting, because he then veers off into another direction, starts talking a lot about God, which he hadn't done in the seminar at all. So I just found that really interesting. I don't think we really have time to go much into that, but I guess the real question I had for you, and I guess this goes back to what George was saying in a way, is that just kind of what you think about Whitehead's general reticence towards the topic of ethics. And the two that really jumped out at me, one is the bit where Cabot asks him right at the end of his presentation, he's like, do you want to take the question suggested for discussion, which was like what he was supposed to be basing his whole presentation around, and he just ignored it. And he was just sort of, oh, shucks, you should answer those. And if I was Cabot, I would have been like really annoyed at Whitehead, like, why didn't you answer these? These are the questions you were supposed to be answering. But then the other thing is, and this is where I wonderfully get to cheat again, is that we have a journal from one of Whitehead's TAs in 1933, and I'll just paste the quote into the chat, but he was having this talk with Whitehead where he said, as for finding the ground for an ethic, Whitehead confessed his inability to think the complexity of the situation through. The key to an ethic, he said, is perhaps so simple that we fail to find it for its simplicity. So this is almost exactly 7 years later after the seminar. So do you have any thoughts about just Whitehead just doesn't seemingly want to, he's like scared of engaging with ethics?
Yeah, I think kind of speaking to the overall work, I think you are much more capable to speak to this. But I think if you read the Cabot seminar, there is, of course, like a moment of humbleness, I guess, next to his colleagues and his students, right? You are the experts in ethics and so on. And I think the general reticence to engage much more with ethics is partly probably explained by that kind of view on the history of philosophy that Professor Lucas has talked about, right? This kind of not being associated with this. And I think part of the provocation that we were trying to do with that paper that we talked about a lot leading up to this is precisely to kind of ignore this and take this very serious, this moment when he speaks about ethics, because one of the things is, if you look at the reformers of that time, people like Lewis Mumford or so, that they want to build a new city, make it ethical, make it a good place to live for people. He develops all these ideas, and then he says, oh yeah, the appropriate metaphysics for this you can find in Whitehead. And then he moves on. And we occasionally kind of get these moments where there's almost like a division of labor, but that also removes the burden of actually engaging with metaphysical or cosmological questions, when you can say, well, I have my very good or need or whatever reformist project, I have my ethical ideas. If you want metaphysics, read this guy. And so kind of, I guess something that we were trying to do is to maybe just as a thought experiment, but to take this kind of moment on ethics that he presents in 20A as serious as we can, and try to read it as coherently as possible, or try to make it fit into one of those blanks somehow.
Thank you both for taking a close look at this. When I saw that you had submitted your paper, I was glad, because I was tempted to write a piece on this, the Cabot seminar, and then I saw that you had done it. I was like, good, and then I don't have to do it. I really enjoyed what you have shared here. A couple of quick question thoughts. One is whether or not, if we are going to have a meaningful form of responsibility for macroscopic societies, so societies such as ourselves, whether or not we need to, does that require us to violate the ontological principle or not? Can we have genuine forms of agency and action? Joseph Bracken will argue, yes, that we need to be willing to fully recognize the agency of what he calls collective individuals, but these societies that we are, these enduring societies, to have meaningful responsibility. So it's a fair question to ask anybody who's going to do ethics in a Whiteheadian vein. And then, so my own answer would be yes, I agree with Bracken to some degree. The second comment is whether or not, well, I just really to appreciate your suggestion on civilization. I've been rereading his works as I've been working with some students, and the word civilization doesn't age well right now in a sort of very post-colonial time. Civilization as a clearly good term is not. It's more fraught than it used to be in ways that it should be. And I love your suggestion of saying, actually, if we look at what he's trying to get at. Is something like ethical or another term, actually communicating better, and it actually avoids the, hopefully it's not just apologetics. I'm hoping what we're doing is representing his ideas and taking a term which is now more fraught than it was then. And so ethical to me is a very interesting idea I'd like to keep thinking through. So thank you for both of those suggestions. I don't know if you had a quick thought on either of those.
Maybe I'll just quickly take the second point you made and add. I think, I'm not quite sure if I remember the byline correct, but I think you wrote this this piece on the blog that you find in Martin Luther King, right? The way he uses that concept of civilization, and if you listen to his Nobel Prize speech, and he basically only quotes Whitehead. That's like the only person that explicitly quoted. And what does he quote? He quotes the moments of civilization, right? He says, okay, these are the precise quotes. I think they're both from Adventures of Ideas. So I think this is very fruitful, and kind of with more time, developing it precisely in this direction would be incredibly interesting, precisely because I think every time he talks about these notions of openness, he comes up with civilization pretty quickly, like in the Adventures of Ideas, when he talks about the gospel of force versus the gospel of uniformity, and how to negotiate between them in a civilized manner, right? And yes, the concept has not aged very well, and I think most people, a lot of kind of people probably are more afraid to touch these or to quote these passages extensively, I guess, apart from Isabelle Stengers, who always takes this in her reading. She's very open about that kind of, that she uses civilization as a Whiteheadian concept, puts it in the title of her works and so on. But other than this, I'm not aware of. I mean, there's the book from the 50s or something, the Johnson book, Whitehead's Philosophy of Civilization, but that hasn't aged too well. But just
good
as a follow-up to this thought.
We're at time, but I'd love to get Paul in here if we could sneak it in. If people need to go, obviously I understand.
Just a very quick comment. Not strictly about your reading of the ethical implications, but a comment that I hope you will find supportive. In the last 20 years or so, in at least the English-speaking philosophy of science I'm the most familiar with, philosophy of biology, there's been a real resurgence of interest in Whitehead, specifically in process studies generally. And my understanding of the motive there is precisely because they want to see biological interactions as not merely self-centered, egocentric, private, and therefore inherently competitive. They want to make room for mutualism and mutual cooperation in their biological understanding. And they don't have many directions they can turn for support, right? Metaphysical backdrop. And they really find Whitehead helps. So it seems to me that gives ample room for exactly where you want to go with this.
I couldn't agree more, Paul.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Couldn't agree more, Paul. Thank you both, Milan and Daniel. What a great paper. Just to follow in Joe's footsteps and to push my recent project that I just finished, publishing a book on Whitehead and the metaphysical foundations of environmental ethics is hopefully forthcoming soon on just these topics. So George Lucas is right. We disagree on a number of things, this one being the one, and one of them, but I really think you've given some really creative ways of thinking about these and taken a brand new piece. And this is exactly what we'd hope the conference would achieve, is taking these interesting new pieces, getting a reason to read them and think about what do they mean on their own, and then in relationship to the rest of Whitehead's work. So thank you guys. Thank you all to all of our speakers. Let's give everybody another virtual round of applause for the great papers today. We will see everybody who's able and interested to have us for another set of sessions tomorrow. You can find the program on the website, and the recording will be available on YouTube as we're able to do so. Thank you all for being here today and for contributing to the life of studying Whitehead's life and work. See you hopefully tomorrow. Bye-bye.